And my hope is that this series will add some value in terms of our work together to build a better world out of all the issues that we've been facing recently. So along those lines, the goal of this presentation today is around growing cooperative enterprise. I want to put co-ops in the context of rebuilding from the pandemic and the recession, and rebuilding in a way that's more equitable and resilient. I want to talk a little bit about how co-ops can help us sustain local jobs, local businesses, how they're relevant across the economy, and then present some of the basics of starting a co-op. I'll share that I'm a little daunted by that. That's a lot to do in one webinar, especially since co-op development can vary so much across communities, type of co-op, even state law. So my goal is going to be trying to go through my slides fairly quickly. So a little bit on our context. We're facing the largest recession since the Great Depression. We've got a wave of small business closures, large-scale unemployment and job instability, housing insecurity, hunger and food insecurity, climate change, welcome recognition of the challenge of systemic racism and economic inequality, division in government, which is really impeding the ability of government to respond to a lot of the challenges that we're facing. But within all that, we've got some glimmers of the possibility and opportunity to rebuild better. And one of the questions people are asking is what are our options for rebuilding? What are the economic alternatives we have? Wouldn't it be great if we had a business model that was based in self-help and participation, was rooted in our communities, accountable to the people it served, put common good before private gain, was more sustainable, more equitable, democratic, and inclusive, more accessible, flexible, and innovative? And wouldn't it be great if it was a tested model, proven and resilient? And I'm just going to touch on this a little bit. This is something I covered in the previous session. But what has always struck me about this is co-ops have been the most important in our economy when we face challenges like this. In fact, the origins of the modern cooperative movement are really in the Industrial Revolution and the onset of capitalism. People often think about capitalism as something that has been around forever, but modern capitalism, investor-owned business, and the cooperative model actually both emerged at the same time in the 1800s. And both, are viable ways of running the economy, albeit with different priorities. So in the 1800s, the Rochdale Society of Equitable Pioneers formed a member-owned grocery store. This, reflected the food insecurity for working people at the time. And their goal was simply to provide healthy, affordable food. But their broader vision was to create a viable economic alternative, a cooperative commonwealth that could be guided and controlled by working people. And they're credited with establishing the principles for modern cooperative enterprise. I always like to emphasize that the pioneers didn't invent this model out of thin air. In fact, in many ways, it resembles diverse traditions of mutual aid, whether you're talking about indigenous patterns of resource sharing and land ownership, mutual aid, informal lending circles, a lot of the agricultural activities we might be familiar with, like collective land clearing, harvest activities. They were also building on a lot of experiments in cooperative enterprise, some of which succeeded and many of which failed. But their real success was creating a legal model for an economic alternative. And that model very early on became the focus of groups like the International Cooperative Alliance, who formed in 1895 to make it available and adapt it to local needs around the world as more and more communities started facing globalization and the expansion of capitalism. And certainly the Farmers Union, founded in 1902 as the Educational Cooperative Union of America, was one of these groups that was focused on the dissemination of the Rochdale principles, which are still included in NFU's policy. Today, the International Cooperative Alliance is sort of the steward of the cooperative identity, the principles, the values. I think it's a beautiful statement. Sometimes I try to find a way to communicate it in a way that might be more accessible to people, particularly to business people, thinking about how this model compares to other ways of doing business. So my sort of summary is a cooperative is a business that's jointly owned and democratically controlled by its members. Those are the people who actively use it to meet their needs and goals. And then any income left over at the end of the year, what's called surplus in a co-op or profit in a conventional business, is then reinvested in the enterprise or distributed among members, not in proportion to their investment, but in proportion to how much they use the cooperative. So it's a very, very different approach to structuring an enterprise that has, I think, very important implications both for operating co-op and how you go about starting a co-op. The other thing that's important to notice is co-ops today are much more common than most people think. There are about 1 billion members worldwide. 1 in 3 people in the US are members of co-ops. Globally, more people are members than directly own stock in investor-held corporations. Majority of US farmers are co-op members. They're also very innovative and successful. And while it's not very easy to learn about them in business schools, they are very important players in the global economy. So part of the reason I raise that is if you want to start a co-op, one of the most important things you've got to do is figure out how you're going to make the case. Like, why are you starting a cooperative? Why would someone join it? Why would you convert a business? Why would someone invest money? What do co-ops offer today? And that's part of what I want to get to as sort of an intro to how to go about starting a co-op. One place to start is to think about how co-ops have helped us in the past. My personal perspective is that co-ops have always been important and they always add value, but there's definitely points in history where you can see that co-ops made an enormous difference in people's lives, whether they were addressing market failures where private enterprise or government were not meeting people's needs. They've been very important helping small players such as family farmers successfully compete against investor-owned corporations and economic consolidation. And they play an important role in enabling producers, workers, and consumers to have an alternative to that sort of investor-driven model, which, especially in cases of monopoly, is often seen as our only choice. The impact of that legacy in the United States is very visible. Co-ops played a crucial role in helping rural communities electrify, enabling farmers to access power, and even today, more than half the US landmass is powered by co-ops. As I mentioned, more than half of America's family farmers are members of a co-op. The farm credit system enabled family farmers to access credit when private lenders wouldn't lend the money. And the mutual insurance model was also pioneered by farmers when insurance companies would not cover them. So how can we make the case for how co-ops can help us now? This was a question that came before the board of the National Cooperative Business Association in 2016 when we began a visioning process to try to define what we saw as the contribution of co-ops to the challenges that we face in the modern world. And around that same time, the Rockefeller Foundation released a report on the need for building a more inclusive economy that could better meet the needs of more people in their communities. And we saw their description of this inclusive economy that enabled more people to participate and have more say over their futures, more opportunities for equity and upward mobility for more people, an economy that was growing and meeting the needs of more people, economic stability that would provide people with more confidence in their future, and a sustainable economy in which community wealth was sustained over generations. And of course, we looked at this and realized they were talking about co-ops. They just didn't realize it, and we had to figure out a way to communicate what they were missing about the cooperative model. And so we came up with this, this vision for NCBA Inclusive, which is to build a better world and a more inclusive economy that empowers people to contribute to shared prosperity and well-being for themselves and future generations. And then importantly, we started working with partner organizations to start developing research and policy recommendations on how cooperatives could fulfill that potential. And this is a report from the Urban Institute. You can download it at NCBA Inclusive's website on the important role co-ops can play in access to economic independence, business sustainability, community involvement and commitment, democratic governance, expanding equity, diversity, and inclusion, promoting financial security for workers, and a growing economy that can meet the needs of more people. So reports like that can be very valuable to people looking to start new co-ops, to help them make the case and help people understand whether it's prospective members, local government, community members, funders, on what it is that you're trying to accomplish through a co-op. At this moment of instability, there's a particular case to be made for the resilience of co-ops. Because they're owned by the people who actively use them. They root jobs and wealth and infrastructure in the community. And because they're more sustainable and resilient over time, they can contribute to a more sustainable local community. But for each startup group, sorry that photo's so fuzzy. You know, when you are doing your organizing, doing your recruiting, reaching out to prospective members, you'll want to figure out how to make all of those characteristics that I just laid out speak to whoever it is you're trying to communicate with. What is the unmet need that you're trying to meet in your community? Is it about the local economy that really gets local people or prospective members excited? Are they interested in developing economic democracy, or is it about a more equal and equitable way of doing business? Is it around climate change and sustainability? Is it community resilience? Each of these, you know, will speak to a different audience. And for startup organizers, you want to think about what is your key argument? What is it you're trying to basically sell in your community? So now I just want to talk a little bit about how to think about different ways of structuring a co-op. The other very fortunate or positive thing about the cooperative model is how flexible it is. And one of the things we're seeing, as I mentioned a little earlier, historically, rural communities have been real innovators in cooperative enterprise, and that continues to be the case as needs change. And one of the things we're seeing now is a whole new wave of rural cooperative innovation that's focused on emerging needs, whether it's home care for seniors or accessing broadband, clean energy, housing and childcare, food insecurity, whether it's on the producer end or the consumer end, platform co-ops for gig workers, information technology, and importantly, business succession and maintaining jobs as you know, wave of baby boomers are set to retire, and we don't know if those businesses will continue to survive and thrive or not. So this flexibility is an advantage, and when you're organizing a co-op, I think it'll be important to think about what is that core activity, what's the gap that you're trying to fill in your community or among a set group of members. Is it around providing livelihood, securing products and services, shelter? Is it producing and marketing products together? What is the core sort of activity that you want to accomplish, and why is a co-op a better way to do it? You can also think about co-ops in sort of conventional industry terms, whether agriculture co-ops, fishing co-ops, food co-ops, all down this list. And part of the reason I raise this is just to think about how flexible the model is, the different parts of the economy co-op can play a role in, and then also thinking about who are your peers as a startup. Because it's been my experience that those most successful startups are the ones that very early on took advantage of reaching out to other cooperatives, cooperative associations, and other types of support. And co-ops are extraordinarily collaborative in their willingness to share experiences and models and lessons with each other. So I can't recommend that highly enough. You can also think about the business model in terms of stakeholder. And often when people talk about agricultural co-ops, they think immediately about the farmer or producer co-op model. But you could also form an agricultural co-op as a worker co-op, right? Basically owning and operating a farm together instead of it being individual farms in a cooperative. You could also organize a consumer co-op that's basically sourcing produce. But obviously it can also be a farmer cooperative. So there's multiple ways to meet needs based on the stakeholder group that you're thinking about. To make things interesting, you can also form a co-op of co-ops and achieve scale and efficiencies in that way. And you can also form a multi-stakeholder co-op with different types of member. And actually in our association, we've helped incorporate a number of food co-ops that are both worker and consumer. I'm also aware of some that are worker, consumer, and producer. The only thing to be aware of there is it can make things more complicated, but if you treat those different member types or classes as a strength, it can actually very much support the success of the business over time. Also want to emphasize it's a very flexible business model in terms of scale. And there's two critiques you often hear about co-ops, and particularly agricultural co-ops. One is they're all too large, and the other is they're all too small. And the point there is that co-ops can be scaled to the needs of their members. Some co-ops actively choose to stay small and local as the best way to meet the needs of their members. And some focus on scale and bringing in as many members as they can to be able to compete on a much different level with much larger players. Neither of those approaches is wrong or right. It's just the which approach is the most appropriate for the members and their goals. So paths to forming a cooperative. I just want to mention there's sort of two ways to approach this. One is to create a new business, which can be a long process. We've had a number of food co-ops that have organized for a decade or more before actually opening their store. But it is more flexible in terms of mission and purpose, and you'll be creating new jobs and infrastructure. Those are all really good things, but patience and persistence, will be very important to cooperative organizing. Another way to approach it is to convert an existing business, which can be a lot quicker. You've got an existing customer base, systems, infrastructure, a going concern is already in place, and if you organize well, you stand to gain the skills and knowledge of the current owner and staff, right? An ideal situation is that the current owner, the current employees, maybe even some of the people who either shop there or provide raw materials to this business are excited to be members and become joint owners within the enterprise. And in doing so, we can retain existing jobs and infrastructure. And as I mentioned before, in the face of this sort of wave of baby boomers retiring, and now with the impact of the pandemic, I think the potential for cooperatives in transitioning businesses that might otherwise be lost into community ownership is a real opportunity. So very basic steps for forming a co-op. And I want to emphasize there's no shortage of lists for how to start a co-op out there. And I would say that they're probably all right. And your group needs to figure out which list makes the most sense to you. I put mine together with a few added things that I think are crucially important. And one of the first ones is just learning the basics of cooperative principles, the business model, the history. I think it's so essential both to make the case to prospective members, funders, et cetera, but also to sort of the stability and cohesion of the group moving forward, that you understand what it is you're actually trying to organize. Step 2, share that idea with a core group of potential co-leaders. Form a steering committee of committed collaborative leaders. Work with them to draft a purpose or vision statement based on the needs that you're seeing in your community. Crucially, network with other co-ops and cooperative associations, both for the peer support, the learning, the guidance you can get. You may also learn that there's another co-op or effort out there that's already doing what you're trying to do, and it might be advantageous to try to work together. Conduct a realistic feasibility study and develop a business plan. I say realistic feasibility study because there's definitely quite a few examples I've seen out there, feasibility studies that, well, they just weren't realistic. They did not really assess whether it was consumer demand or the interest of potential members, the market that the business was going into. So it's really important to get someone who knows how to do a feasibility study to give you good information to work from. You'll want to raise initial funds and hire a project coordinator if possible. Incorporate under state co-op statutes. I think, from my point of view, it's very important to actually use cooperative statutes to form a co-op for a variety of reasons. 1, ensuring the rights of your members. 2, ensuring that the business is actually beholden to operating in a cooperative manner. And the statutes would fulfill both those requirements. 8, create a membership agreement and begin your outreach. 9, hold your first meeting of the membership and elect your initial board. 10, hire appropriate management and acquire facilities. And appropriate, make sure you're hiring a manager who knows what they're getting into. They understand what it is to be a member-owned cooperative and be overseen by a board of directors, right? This is, again, it's not a sole proprietorship. And it's not an investor-held business where your only goal is to maximize profit. It's being accountable to the needs and goals of members, which can be both a complicated task and also a really rewarding task. I've worked in co-ops most of my career, and that piece of the work is probably one of the most challenging as well as most rewarding. 11, open for business. 12, just want to emphasize, once you've got a viable business, join local, regional, and national co-op associations. If your co-op is eligible, join the Farmers Union, be part of the infrastructure that supports cooperative growth and development. And then finally, make sure you're providing ongoing cooperative education and training for your members, directors, and staff. So that's just a snapshot. I know that was a lot. So some keys to success and some of the places we've seen, stumbles. Make sure you've got clear roles and decision-making within your effort from the beginning. Make sure you're networking with other co-ops and associations, that you're seeking out appropriate technical support, whether that's lawyers, accountants, development professionals. Make sure they can give you references on other cooperatives that they've worked with. And finally, that ongoing education and training in the cooperative principles, board leadership and member engagement, oversight, project and strategic planning, and communication, facilitation, and conflict resolution. So 6, wow, I did go through that fast. We got a lot of good time here. So resources, this was hard for me to put together, not knowing who was necessarily in the room. And what you were most interested in. So I tried to put together some general resources that would lead you to more resources. And the first of those is the National Cooperative Business Association. where you not only can get acquainted with the basics of the cooperative model, but sign up for news, reports, other things that will help you be acquainted with what's going on in the cooperative movement, issues before cooperatives. It'll also give you access to this wider network of peer supporters linked to associations. There's a list of development centers there, so depending on what state or part of the country you're in, there may be a development center or association there that can help you in your efforts, whether it's raising funds, providing technical assistance, etc. NCBA also has a directory of the state statutes, so you can go to the website, download it, and find out what the co-op statutes in your state look like. For rural co-ops, and particularly agriculture, we're fortunate to still have a pretty robust cooperative development service in USDA. And there's a lot of resources there. It used to be really focused on production, on ag and fisheries, but increasingly there's resources there. For example, worker co-ops, business conversions. There's startup templates. I think there's a feasibility study template, Co-ops 101, as well as like a whole listing of grants and other funding sources, particularly for that pre-development funding you might be looking for. Obviously, state farmers union chapters, some of which even have their own development centers. I know Rocky Mountain does, and I'm sure, tell me all the other ones that have like dedicated development services. But whether they have a development center or not, get involved in that local chapter, because they will have connections with other co-ops and other co-op members and other access to other resources that can help you. And then finally, the local, regional, and national associations. And this could, depending on where you are, probably internet searches are the easiest way to do this, just searching for co-op associations in your area. But there's sector-based ones like the National Council of Farmer Co-ops. There are national federations like the U.S. Federation of Worker Co-ops, as well as local groups like the Valley Alliance of Worker Co-ops in our region. Similarly, there's a national food co-op association, as well as our own regional association. And another sort of untapped resource is a lot of the cross-sector associations. And whether or not whether or not they represent co-ops that are not of the kind that you're trying to organize, they may have business advice for you. And importantly, they may also have members, audiences, marketing that can help you grow your co-op and reach more people. One example I often think of for us as food co-ops is the number of credit unions we have in our region with thousands of members. We have 150,000 individual members. And we work with those credit unions to try to encourage those individual members to join other co-ops. So there's a lot of opportunity to work with those cross-sector federations in growing your cooperative. So that's where I want to wrap up. Thank you so much for listening to me. I hope I didn't go too fast there, and I hope the information I shared with you was effective.